Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that quick break. And I just wanted to say a very big thank you to Gabby. We've had a really great morning talking about AI, starting with the exploration of AI technology and the IP industry with Ashley, and then discovering how Patsnap's putting it to practice with Gabby. Before we jump into our next session with Per Wendin of Spotify, we want to do one more giveaway. So somebody who is active in the chat will receive a $100 gift card. So if you pop some noise in the chat, send some gifts, do something fun, then we can pick a winner. I'll give it a couple of seconds. Can see lots of chats. Oh, lots of gifts. I love the gifts. And our winner is, drum roll, Jennifer Halder. Congratulations, Jennifer. We will be in contact with you after the conference to get your prize sorted. Anyways, moving on, without further ado, let's extend a warm welcome to our next esteemed speaker, Per Wendin, Head of IP R&D at Spotify. And he will take us on a journey to uncover the power of intellectual asset mapping frameworks and the strategies that hold the key to unlocking value in knowledge companies. Hope you enjoy the session. Over to you, Per.
Welcome everyone to this presentation about intangible assets. And my name is Per Wendin. I currently work at Spotify, and I will do a short presentation of myself later on. If you thought that this would be a presentation about patent searches, then you have been misled or not well informed. But I hope you nevertheless should find this quite interesting, because intangible assets are a very valuable asset type for most companies, as we will see in this presentation. Being at Spotify, of course, you have to have today's playlist. As I said, just a few words about myself, and then we're going to go into the intangible asset management sort of thinking that we're currently doing. And basically two parts of that. One, where we'll explain the differences between intangibles and intangibles. And then I'm going to show the kind of intellectual or intelligent asset management framework that we created at Spotify, and a bit of an idea of how we're actually using that. So who am I? I've been head of the IP R&D at Spotify since 2017. So at Spotify, we have divided IP into two parts. There's a legal part, which mostly is concerned with litigations. And then there's what we call the IP R&D part, which I'm heading, and which is connected with all the engineers at Spotify, where we're sort of trying to retrieve all the different innovations that we are doing and control them and protect them in a way that I will explain to you in this presentation. I've been around in the industry for quite some time. You can probably see from this presentation that I didn't graduate last year. I've been having a couple of jobs over the years. I actually started off as a patent examiner at the European Patent Office. Long ago, it was in those days when there used to be a West Germany and an East Germany even. So you can imagine roughly when that was. And then I had a couple of different positions in the companies like Ericsson. I worked for Cisco for a while. I have my own IP consulting company called Capea, and then I did another company within software called Research Laboratories. So some of these companies I've been sort of focusing on IP, and other ones I've actually done other things as well. So that's about me. So what am I listening to? That's obviously a very important thing, if you're working for a company like Spotify. I'm one of these people who are pretty mixed between podcasts and music. So when it comes to podcasts, quite a lot around politics, actually. I very much enjoy The Economist. Everything they do basically is quite good. Music, I'm very diverse, actually. So everything, from classical music, Mozart, over to jazz, Miles Davis, and even Billie Eilish, So you can imagine, that Spotify has a huge issue of trying, to make good recommendations for me, creating a user profile with someone, with such diverse music taste, it's not that easy, but it's managing quite well, actually. All right. Intangible asset management. What is that? Firstly, let's try, to explain some of the words in here. So we have tangible and we have intangible assets. So for those of you who haven't really studied economics and so forth, this is probably quite a useful session for you. Tangible assets are basically all the physical assets that a company possesses. It could be things like property, it could be plant and certain types of equipment. They are traditionally used, of course, very much in manufacturing industries. And one very important thing from a financial and economics perspective, they actually do show up on the company's balance sheet. So if you want to understand, how much a company has in terms of value, you can go to the balance sheet and look at the tangible assets. The intangible assets, however, are non-physical assets. And that's the kind of thing we're going to explain in these presentations. But the problem with these non-physical assets is that they mostly don't actually show up on companies' balance sheets as an asset. But they are nevertheless very, very important for knowledge companies. And I know that many people of you have seen probably this graph before. It was created by Ocean Tobo quite a number of years ago, which explains really this shift, in the industry between tangible and intangible assets. So this graph here shows basically the S&P 500 market, which is basically the biggest US companies, and how the shift from tangible to intangible assets have been done over the last basically, 50 years, from 1975 to 2020. If you go back to 1975, you can see from this graph, that 17% only of the company values or assets were coming from intangible assets, and 83% were coming from tangible assets. And you can also see, that by 2020, it had shifted completely. So today, the intangible assets is basically that's 90% of the company assets value, and only 10% is the tangible assets. This slide you might not have seen, but it's actually the equivalent one of European companies. So it's not as striking as, for example, the US S&P on the left side is. You can see, that the intangible assets still, dominate over the tangible assets, but not to the same extent, that it has in the US. And also, you haven't really seen this very big trend, a change, in the over the years. So you can probably figure out, that in the US, you have lots and lots of companies like probably, I would say, Meta, Amazon, Google, and Apple, who don't really have any sort of physical assets in the company. All they have really is a lot of knowledge and intangible assets, that make up the value of the organization. In Europe, the industry tends maybe to be a little bit more, if I call it, traditional or old-fashioned. A lot of car industry, obviously, the car industry in Germany, for example, is very dominating with all the suppliers. So it still relies very much, on tangible assets, manufacturing plants, and natural resources. But it's an interesting shift, in this industry overall. And I think the fact, what I've just said, that intangible assets are very difficult to assign a value to, but you still know that they're valuable, and therefore you need to understand how to control and protect them. I did a calculation back in January this year for certain types of companies to show, the difference between intangibles and tangibles. It's then obviously a couple of months old, but it doesn't really change, the message of this slide. If you look at the bottom of the slide, you have very tangible companies, if I call them that, something like British Petroleum, for example, who is in the energy business, they, of course, the majority of their assets will be in the tangible ones. I haven't really studied British Petroleum per se, but I assume, they have a lot of oil rigs. They might even have oil wells and a lot of manufacturing capabilities, basically, to change the oil into whatever petroleum or what they do. So they rely very, very much, on tangible assets. And I wouldn't say that they are not a knowledge company, but, probably in terms of what they're actually owning and so forth, the absolute majority of the company, comes probably from these types of manufacturing plants and so forth. At the very top, on the other hand, is our own company, Spotify, which is the complete reverse, to British Petroleum. We are a media streaming company, and the intangible really constitute 87%, of the asset value of the company, although it's actually not on the book itself. So if you go, to the company report, you wouldn't see a huge number, for intangible assets, but we know that this is the fact. I mean, the physical sort of components of Spotify is very, very small. Basically, everything, that we own is basically intangibles. And therefore, it's, of course, very important for us to control them. And then you have a couple of different companies in between, to show, the difference. I mean, I took, for example, at the almost next to the bottom is SCA as a big Swedish forestry company. Also, dominantly in the tangible asset type. They own a lot of forestry, paper mills, and so forth in order to take care of that wood, and make it into pulp or whatever they're doing. And then you have the AstraZeneca, who's a British-Swedish pharmaceutical company, which is somewhere in between. The pharmaceutical company, I haven't really studied the details of this, but I would assume, that pharmaceutical companies obviously have a lot of patents. They have a lot of knowledge that they want to protect, but they also have some manufacturing plants, for their drugs, for example. So it is very industry dependent, and you need to understand, what type of industry you're in really in order to know if your intangibles or tangibles are the most value driver of the company. So knowing, that intangible assets are a valuable asset, how are they actually created? Well, as most times, it's actually start with the individuals, the people we hire in the companies, what we call the human capital. People come, with their knowledge, they come with their experiences, skills, and creativity. And this is obviously something that every company wants, to have transformed into products and services. But whatever they bring with them really, is something that they own. What's in their head, is really in their possession. So what it comes down to really for the company is to make sure, that some of that, at least, what they're creating, during the term, that they work for the company, that ownership, and gets transferred over to the company. So basically, how do we do that? So how do we do that? Well, firstly, most companies, I would assume, would have an employment agreement, with the people saying that whatever you produce, during your working hours and so forth while you're employed, really belongs to the company, doesn't belong to you. So it really comes down to the fact, that we ask these people, to document what they're doing, to create things like technical inventions, data, databases, brand, research results, and so forth. So we actually have these people writing down in one way or another. It could be computer code or whatever it is, what they're working on. So it doesn't really just stick in their heads, because they leave with that knowledge, really. So intellectual assets here, is an important denomination. And a lot of times, we want to control these intellectual assets with intellectual property and intellectual property rights. So we would, for example, patent some of this, would keep them as trade secrets. We would copyright some of this. We'd register them as trademarks and design registrations. That's really, the flow of the information and the output, from individuals in an organization. As you can see from the arrow at the very bottom, the control over these things actually move as we go to the right in this figure. So this is basically a graph, or a drawing that could be used for any type of company that develop products or services, no matter, if it mostly resides in the intangibles or if it's really with intangibles. It's a pretty generic one, but it's important to remember, that it really has to go, from the individual, him or herself, over, to the company possession, and then being able to control that intellectual asset that the individual has produced. So this is now a little bit about the framework we created. I wanted to, because we know that these intangibles create such a value for Spotify. If we look, for example, at the market value, it's obviously much higher, than the book value is. This is public numbers, so there's nothing which is confidential about that. Anyone can go, into our reporting and see, what the market value. Well, you can take the market value as the number of shares in the company times the share price, and compare that with the book value, and you see, that the market value is strikingly higher, for example, than the asset value that we report, in this stage. So, what does that mean? Well, we know that all these intangibles that we produce within the company has a lot of value. It's just a matter of, can we define them, and can we control them in any way? So we want to go from unspecified, diffuse, and scattered knowledge to defined manageable intellectual assets or intangible assets. Sometimes we use the word intellectual asset and sometimes intangible asset. It doesn't really matter which one you're using. I just wanted to say that this framework, is basically based on work done by the CIP. This is an education in Gothenburg in Sweden, university material. So it's not really, the framework as such is not something that we have created. We just adapted it, to the Spotify certain situation. And as you will see, from the presentation, this kind of framework can probably be used for many types of different industries. For example, if you're working in the bank sector, or if you're working in a telecoms operator company, you can probably create a similar one. The thinking is really an academical work, that can be quite useful for many organizations. So we came up with 5 different kind of main categories. The first one being tech assets, the second one being data assets, the third one being brand assets, the fourth one being relational assets, and the fifth one being structural assets. And you can see them here. These are the 5 different types of main categories. Again, I think, that it would probably on this level be quite similar to many other organizations as well. It's just, that way, if we go to the next level, which I'll show you quite soon, that is probably where it's going to differ a bit. So the tech assets is the portfolio of key knowledge and technology, which enables Spotify services, feature, and products. And if you're not familiar with Spotify, obviously, as I said at the very beginning, we are a audio streaming organization. So we stream music, we stream podcasts, and also now audiobooks in some countries. So a lot of technology, of course, is needed for doing that. We've, everything, from the fact that we stream from somewhere in the cloud, down to the end user, who might be sitting, in their car, they might be sitting at home, and being basically providing that audio stream, to go from a server somewhere over to that user's phone or computer. That kind of is one of the technologies we're doing, obviously. So when we looked into this pillar here, we came up with different types of subcategories, So tech assets obviously is just the main category, and then we created underneath, different types of subcategories. So these were the 5 that we thought would be relevant to us. And again, as I said before, this is probably because we are, if we call ourselves, a software company or a platform company, even, we found that there would be technical solutions, there are algorithms, there are machine learning models, there are technical know-how, and there are research results. So as you can imagine, algorithms would be a very fundamental technical assets within the Spotify. If you are, for example, a pure hardware company, or you're doing home appliances, you might have some algorithms, in the products, but probably, there would be other technical assets that probably would be a very small subcategory for your company. Not for us, though. I mean, the algorithms here, and machine learning models are really, really outstanding subcategories in this pillar. Then we have data assets, and that's the data, information, intelligence that Spotify derives or gains access to via its services, feature, and products. And they can probably assume, that this is a very, very important asset type for Spotify. Being a global platform with more than 500 million users, we have a lot of data about, the way that people use the services that goes back, into the system, for which we can use, for really optimizing the service to be personalized for each individual. Trying, to recommend, the right type of content for that person in a particular scenario and so forth. So this is a huge one for us. We have been using some master thesis students actually to work with our framework. And we had, for example, 2 master thesis students who worked particularly on this data pillar 2 years ago. So they came up with 6 different types of subcategories. We actually had only 5 before, so they did a pretty good job. It really starts off, with the raw data at the very top, which is the unstructured and unprocessed data. So not extremely useful as such. And then it ends really, with the data-derived predictions, which is the futuristic forecasting of events and so forth that we think might be happening. And then everything in between. So as you move from raw data to data-derived predictions, you will see, that the data is getting more and more structured on here. So that data, together with some of the machine learning models on the left side of the technology assets, are used, for example, for making, content recommendations, understanding, as I said before, what should we really be using for this person. But it also, can be used for changing, the degree for individuals, adapting it to the user's best needs, really. The third one is a brand asset, which of course, again, is quite different from the first one, but it's a traditional one. It's a portfolio of marks, designs, and expressions which identify the source of a product, service, or feature as distinct to Spotify. And again, here we have actually some, not some interns, but we actually had multi-thesis students who looked at, the brand asset types within Spotify and came up, with the 4 subcategories as you see here. There are independent marks. For example, Spotify, the things, we register normally as trademark, like Spotify, for example, some of the playlists, have independent marks. But it's also product design, the way the product looks. We sometimes also protect that one, the GUI, for example. The visual expressions in here, for example, illustrations, photography, videos, things, that people really, when they see it, immediately think, this is really Spotify, the way we sort of communicate in that way. And then there's the tone of voice, which is actually one of the subcategories, which we didn't have in the past, which we came up with as a subcategory to ourselves. That's the embodiment and expression of Spotify's brand personality in written and spoken communication. So, for example, we do marketing campaign and so forth, that people see if you go with the tube, for example, in New York or somewhere else in the world, and you see an ad, for example, you immediately think of, you don't even have to see, that this is really Spotify on the ad, but you can feel, from the sort of message type and so forth, that this is Spotify. And then there are 2 more. It's the relational assets. That's the portfolio of assets which are dependent on or define our relationship with external parties. So again, 5 different types of subcategories: all platform content, customer databases, licenses and agreements, partnership relations, and digital channels. So relationship assets is an important one, obviously. I mean, for example, all the kind of content, that we license from rights holders would be a relational asset. Of course, a huge part, to the success of Spotify as an organization. We rely very much on that. Lastly, the pillar, will be structural asset, which is the institutional measures Spotify has developed organically or intentionally to shape the way that we operate, how we operate. For example, the way we are organized as an organization and the way, we do our development and R&D work. It could also be sort of policies, business plans, and strategies. So this is, the overall kind of asset framework that we created. The 3 pillars to the left, the tech assets, the data assets, and the brand assets, are the ones that we primarily used, in R&D, where we develop new services and features for the product. We don't work, my team doesn't really work with the relational and structured asset to the right, although we have them of course, in the frameworks to make it complete. The focus is really on the 3 to the left. As a further step to the framework itself, we basically, to each of these subcategories or asset types, try to understand, how to best control them. And as you can see, at the very bottom of this slide, there are 5 different types of IP and IPRs, that go with each of these asset types. You've got patents, you've got trade secrets, you've got copyright, trademarks, and designs. So what we did was that we, to each of the subcategories, decided, which of these, would be the best used IP and IPR. So, for example, at the very top left, for example, under technical solutions, you can see that you can patent that, but you can also use it as a trade secret. And for each then of the other pillars, like data assets and brand assets, we also put it in there. I think one thing that sort of was pretty interesting when we did this exercise was to see that trade secrets is obviously a very important type an IP right for a company like Spotify, being, a platform organization. For example, the technical assets, very few of them actually lend themselves extremely well for patents, although we do patent things, where it's useful. But actually, trade secret is quite an important IP right. That's certainly true, basically for all the data assets, which are quite difficult to control in other ways. Brand assets obviously is a different thing. You would trademark, your independent marks. The product designs, you would have design rights for. In the US, they called design patterns. In other jurisdictions, they call it something else. But basically, you protect the design of something. And your visual expression, really, you want to copyright that one. Tone of voice, we didn't actually find a good IP-wide way of actually controlling it. So it still remains to see if that's possible or not. And for the relational assets and the structure assets on the right side, you can see the same thing. Most of this is actually really best controlled, protected by trade secrets. So that's quite an important slide for us, and something we're using when we're educating our engineers, particularly the ones who start at Spotify who are quite young. Many of them never had any education of IP or asset management, anything like that in the studies. That's pretty independent of whether they went to school in the US, Sweden, Germany, or Brazil, for example. The general knowledge about IP among engineers is unfortunately quite low worldwide, and this is something we're working with them on actually so that they understand, what the value drivers in their work really is. Addition, of course, to providing the service itself, which is very important. All right, I'll give you an example of how we've been using this in real life. I don't know if you are a Spotify user, and if you have been a Spotify user for some years, we're now getting close to the time of the year when you will receive your Wrapped. And I don't know if that rings a bell with you somewhere, but the Wrapped is really, where we're sending out, on a specific day at Spotify, we send out the information to all of you, what you've been listening to in this year, who were your favorite artists, who were your favorite songs, and so forth. And we're making, I think, a very nice and shiny presentation of that. And it's funny to see, when on that very day, that's one of the things, that is really, really shared on social media worldwide. Instagram, X, and so forth, previously known as Twitter, by the way, and various types of platforms. So it is an important one, and it's quite funny. It actually started as something called your year in review, and you can see on this axis, that it was in a position of where we didn't really have a control of that word or feature. We did protect it in a way, and we didn't actually even understand the value of this. It was only kicked off really, as a little bit of a project. But we realized from the feedback we got, from the users, that this is actually has quite a bit of value. We think this is a valuable feature that we are giving to our users. So, we went up, on the value chain, but not really, on the control chain. We were still sort of on the upper left quadrant, but then we call it Wrapped instead, and just put a trademark Wrapped on it. So still quite no, it wasn't really registered on that one. But of course, then we sought trademark protection for that Wrapped, and now it's registered. So we went, from a position, where we had something which we didn't quite understand the value of, and it was pretty uncontrolled, over, to where we understand and know pretty well, what the value is, and we control it very well. Exactly how big the value is, of course, very difficult to say. We can just tell, from our users' engagement, with the feature, that for them, it actually brings quite a lot of value. So this would be a typical way of actually depicting asset management and show the value to people. So that was pretty short on the intangible asset and the way we think about this at Spotify. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. And if you want to reach out, you can find me on LinkedIn or some other media. Thank you. Bye-bye.